pages stick together tonight, bonded by something darker than ink. Medieval chroniclers wrote with trembling hands. Parents ate their children, children ate their parents. The forests echoed with the screams of the abandoned. The Brothers Grimm called it Hansel and Gretel. History calls it the Great Famine. I call it the 7 years when humanity forgot it was human. This ancient tome has shown me horrors that would break lesser minds, but tonight it reveals something that chills even my immortal soul. Here, where the parchment weeps with the tears of a million mothers, I find not a fairy tale about a gingerbread house and a wicked witch. I find a survival manual, a documentation of the most systematic child abandonment and cannibalism in European history. A record of when an entire continent became a graveyard for the innocent. Welcome back, seekers of forgotten truths. You think you know the story? Let me tell you what really happened when 7 years of darkness fell across medieval Europe and children became livestock. Once upon a time, there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. Times were hard, food was scarce, and the family faced starvation. In desperation, the stepmother convinced the father to abandon the children deep in the forest, where they could no longer be a burden on the family's dwindling resources. The children overheard this plan. Clever Hansel filled his pockets with white pebbles, and when their parents led them into the woods and left them there, he used the stones to mark their path home. But when the family's situation grew even more desperate, they were abandoned again. This time, Hansel could only use breadcrumbs to mark the trail, and the birds ate them all. Lost and starving, the children wandered until they discovered a house made entirely of gingerbread. With windows of clear sugar and a roof of cake, desperate with hunger, they began to eat the house itself. Then a voice called out from inside, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who is nibbling at my house?" An old woman emerged, appearing kind and welcoming. She invited the children inside, fed them milk and pancakes, and let them sleep in comfortable beds. But the next morning revealed her true nature. She was a witch who lured children to her house to fatten them up and eat them. She locked Hansel in a cage and forced Gretel to work as her servant, feeding her brother constantly to make him plump for the feast. When the witch decided Hansel was finally fat enough, she prepared her oven. But clever Gretel tricked the witch into climbing into the oven herself, then slammed the door shut and roasted her alive. The children found the witch's house filled with precious stones and pearls, took what they could carry, and eventually found their way home. Their stepmother had died during their absence, and their father welcomed them back with joy. They lived happily ever after, never again to suffer from hunger. It sounds like a simple moral tale about cleverness, triumphing over evil, about the bonds between siblings, about hope surviving in the darkest circumstances. But this book shows me something far different. Because the Brothers Grimm weren't creating fiction when they wrote this story. They were documenting the most catastrophic demographic disaster in medieval European history. 7 years when starvation drove humanity to abandon its most fundamental taboos. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed more than 25% of Europe's population. 7 years of crop failures, caused by catastrophic weather changes that modern climatologists now understand as the beginning of the Little Ice Age. 7 years when the forest filled with the abandoned, the desperate, and the dying. 7 years when chroniclers across Europe recorded something that defied belief. Parents eating their children, children eating their parents, and the systematic breakdown of every moral constraint that separated humans from beasts. This ancient book trembles in my hands as it reveals the contemporary accounts. Guillaume de Nangis, writing from the Abbey of Saint Denis, recorded, "Men and women ate their own children, and children devoured their parents." The Chronicle of Saint Denis describes a multitude of people who, driven by hunger, fed upon human flesh. In England, the Chronicles of Edward II document cases of parents selling their children for food, and children found roasted in abandoned houses. But these weren't isolated incidents. They weren't the random acts of madness that modern minds want to believe they were. Archaeological evidence reveals that cannibalism during the Great Famine was systematic, organized, and widespread across the continent. Excavations at medieval sites across Germany, France, and England have uncovered bone deposits from this period showing clear evidence of human butchery, cut marks consistent with meat processing. bones cracked for marrow extraction, and skull modifications that suggest organized consumption of human brain tissue. The witch in Hansel and Gretel wasn't a supernatural being. She was one of thousands of desperate adults who had turned to cannibalism as a survival strategy during the famine years. The Brothers Grimm, collecting stories in early 19th century Germany, were preserving folk memories of these real cannibals, who had operated forest hideouts where they lured, captured, and consumed the children who wandered lost through the dying woods. Medieval records from the period describe exactly the scenario depicted in the fairy tale. Chronicles tell of evil women who lived in forest houses, would offer food and shelter to travelers, particularly children, and who were later discovered to be cannibals. Church records from the period document confessions of people who admitted to luring children with promises of food, keeping them captive while fattening them, and then killing and eating them. The gingerbread house represents the food hoarding that became common during the famine. While most of Europe starved, some individuals managed to stockpile preserved foods, not just grains and dried meat, but human meat that they had processed and stored for long-term consumption. Contemporary accounts describe discovering houses that appeared to have abundant food, but which on closer inspection revealed horrifying evidence of their true source of sustenance. The detail about the house being edible is on whimsical fantasy. It's as a psychologically realistic description of how starving children would perceive any dwelling that contained food. When you're dying of hunger, a house containing bread and sugar would indeed seem like something out of a dream, something magical and unreal. The children's immediate impulse to start eating the house reflects the desperate hunger that had driven them beyond normal behavioral constraints. The witch's method of fattening Hansel before eating him corresponds exactly to documented practices from the famine period. Medieval records describe cannibals who would keep captured victims alive for weeks or months, feeding them to improve the quality of their flesh before slaughter. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated food production using human livestock. The oven where the witch planned to cook Hansel serves a dual purpose in the story that reveals its historical basis. Archaeological investigations of suspected cannibal sites from the Great Famine period have found evidence of specialized cooking facilities, ovens, and fire pits that were larger and more sophisticated than needed for normal food preparation. These installations were designed for processing large quantities of meat, including human remains. But the ovens served another purpose that explains their prominence in the Hansel and Gretel story. They were used not just for cooking, but for destroying evidence. Human bones burned differently than animal bones, and experienced cannibals during the famine learned to use high-temperature fires to eliminate traces of their activities. The witch's oven represents both the instrument of murder and the method of concealment that real cannibals used during this period. The children's escape through cleverness rather than rescue reflects the harsh reality of the famine years. There were no authorities coming to save abandoned children, no social safety nets to catch those who fell through the cracks of a collapsing society. Survival depended entirely on individual resourcefulness, on the ability to outwit predators who were often more desperate than evil. Gretel's trick of pushing the witch into her own oven corresponds to documented cases from the period where intended victims managed to turn the tables on their captors. Medieval records include accounts of children who escaped from cannibals by using fire as a weapon, sometimes burning down entire forest dwellings with their captors inside. The detail about the witch being roasted alive is unfantastical justice. It's a historically accurate description of how some cannibal operations were ended. The treasure that the children find in the witch's house reflects another grim reality of the famine period. Cannibals often accumulated wealth from their victims, not just the possessions of those they killed, but payment from desperate families who traded valuables for human meat to feed their surviving children. Archaeological evidence from suspected cannibal sites includes hoards of coins, jewelry, and other precious objects that represent the economic value of human flesh during the starvation years. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Hansel and Gretel story is how accurately it depicts the systematic child abandonment that became common during the Great Famine. This was on a rare or exceptional practice. It was a widespread survival strategy that families across Europe adopted when they could no longer feed all their members. Church records from the period document thousands of cases of parents bringing their children deep into forests and leaving them there. Some left notes or identifying markers, hoping that the children might somehow be found and cared for by others. Most simply walked away, knowing they would never see their children again, but believing that abandonment offered a better chance of survival than slow starvation at home. The stepmother's role in the story reflects the gendered nature of these abandonment decisions. Medieval records show that the choice to abandon children was often made or advocated by stepmothers, second wives who prioritized the survival of their own biological children over stepchildren from previous marriages. The economic calculation was brutal, but logical resources had to be allocated to those most likely to survive and reproduce. Hansel's use of pebbles and breadcrumbs to mark the path home represents desperate hope that many abandoned children maintained. Archaeological evidence from forest sites used for child abandonment includes pathetic attempts by children to create markers that would help them find their way back to their families. Piles of stones, carved marks on trees, and caches of personal objects all testified to the children's refusal to accept that they had been permanently discarded. The failure of the breadcrumb trail speaks to the brutal reality that awaited most abandoned children. Those who managed to find their way home often discovered that their families had moved, died, or simply refused to take them back. The birds eating the breadcrumbs represents the indifferent natural world that offered no help to the lost and desperate. Medieval chronicles describe the forests of Europe during the famine years as filled with the sounds of crying children calling for parents who would never come back. Travelers reported hearing voices in the woods, finding small camps where children had tried to shelter themselves, and discovering bodies of those who had not survived their abandonment. The witch's house represents the false sanctuary that some of these abandoned children encountered. Not all the adults who took in starving children were cannibals, but enough were that the pattern became embedded in folk memory. The initial kindness, followed by deadly betrayal, reflects the experience of children who trusted adults who appeared to offer salvation, but who were actually predators. The Brothers Grimm collected this story in early 19th century Germany, more than 4 centuries after the Great Famine ended. But the folk memory of those 7 terrible years had been preserved through generations of oral storytelling, passed down by families whose ancestors had lived through the horror. The details of the story, the abandonment, the forest wandering, the cannibal's house, the systematic fattening of victims, the specialized oven, all correspond too closely to documented historical practices to be coincidental. What the Brothers Grimm preserved wasn't fantasy, it was testimony. The voices of survivors passed down through centuries of retelling, maintaining the essential truth of what had happened, even as the horror was gradually softened into something that could be told to children without causing immediate trauma. But this transformation from historical documentation into children's entertainment represents a profound loss of cultural memory. The original function of the Hansel and Gretel story was to prepare future generations for the possibility of similar catastrophes. To maintain awareness of how quickly civilization could collapse and what survival might require, by turning it into a fairy tale about supernatural evil defeated by cleverness and luck, we've lost the story as real power, as a warning about the fragility of social order and the extremes to which hunger can drive human behavior. We've transformed a survival manual into entertainment, erasing the memory of millions who died during Europe's darkest years. The pages of this ancient tome grow heavy as I trace the names recorded here. The parents who made impossible choices, the children who wandered lost through dying forests, the desperate souls who crossed the line into cannibalism and could never return. They deserve to be remembered not as cartoon villains and fairy tale heroes, but as human beings who face circumstances that no one should ever have to endure. Modern climate scientists warn that the conditions that caused the Great Famine, sudden shifts in weather patterns that destroy agricultural systems, could happen again. As our climate becomes increasingly unstable, as resources become scarcer and populations larger, the story of Hansel and Gretel may once again become relevant, not as entertainment, but as preparation. The witch's oven still exists in archaeological sites across Europe. The bones of her victims still rest in forest soil that once echoed with the cries of the abandoned. And somewhere in the darkness of future possibilities, the conditions that created the 7-year nightmare may be waiting to return. Tonight, as these blood-stained pages whisper their secrets, I remember why this book chose me as its guardian. It's not to entertain, but to warn. It's not to comfort, but to prepare. Because the greatest tragedy would be to forget what human beings are capable of. When the very foundations of civilization crumble away, the story of Hansel and Gretel ends with the children finding their way home to a father who welcomes them back with joy. But the real story, the one documented in medieval chronicles and preserved in archaeological evidence, ends differently. It ends with the knowledge that in humanity's darkest hours, there may be no home to return to, no father waiting with open arms, no happy ending guaranteed by virtue or cleverness. It ends with the understanding that survival sometimes requires us to become things we never thought we could be, and that the greatest horror isn't the supernatural evil of fairy tale witches, but the very human evil that hunger and desperation can awaken in ordinary people. The ancient tome whispers one final secret as its pages settle into silence. The Brothers Grimm collected more than stories in those German forests. They gathered the testimonies of survivors, the warnings of the wise, the desperate pleas of those who had seen humanity at its worst and somehow lived to tell the tale. Tomorrow night, these blood-stained pages will reveal another truth. Another beloved story that masks a historical horror, another fairy tale that began as a survival manual for the darkest times humanity has ever known. But tonight, we remember the real Hansel and Gretel. Not the clever children who outwitted a magical witch, but the millions of abandoned souls who wandered through Europe's dying forests during 7 years, when civilization itself became the monster in survival. Required crossing lines that should never be crossed. Their voices echo still in these ancient pages. And as long as this book exists, as long as I draw breath to speak their truth, they will not be forgotten. The reckoning continues.